Stop doing this if you want $100,000 faster. You know that feeling when you're lying in bed at night, scrolling through your banking app for the third time that week, and you're doing that mental math thing where you're trying to figure out how long it'll actually take you to hit 100 grand in savings? And every time you run the numbers, it feels like you're looking at a timeline that stretches so far into the future that you can't even picture what you'll look like by then. Maybe you'll have gray hair, maybe you'll have kids, maybe the whole world will be different. But that number, that clean, round, life-changing $100,000, it just sits there on the horizon like a mirage that keeps moving further away the closer you think you're getting to it. And here's the thing that gets me. And honestly, this is something I think about way too much. My name is Adam, and I spend an almost embarrassing amount of time thinking about money, why people make the financial decisions they do, and specifically why some people seem to reach these big financial milestones relatively quickly, while others work just as hard, earn just as much, but somehow end up spinning their wheels in the same spot for years. It's not always about income, which is the weird part. I've seen people making $70,000, $80,000 a year who hit six figures in savings faster than people making 120. And that discrepancy, that gap, it's usually not because of some secret investment strategy or because they inherited money or got lucky with crypto. It's usually because of one specific thing they stopped doing. Or maybe a few things, small behaviors that seem totally harmless, maybe even responsible on the surface, but they're actually these quiet wealth killers that drain your ability to build serious money without you even noticing is happening. And I think what's going to surprise you about this isn't just what these behaviors are, because some of them might seem counterintuitive, like things you've been told are good financial habits, but it's how invisible they are, how they disguise themselves as prudence or responsibility, or just being realistic. And once you see them for what they really are, it's like someone turned the lights on in a room you've been stumbling around in for years. So if you've ever felt like you're doing everything right, but the money just isn't accumulating the way you thought it would, or if you're tired of feeling like you're in this weird financial purgatory where you're not broke, but you're definitely not building wealth either, I think this might actually shift something for you. Let me start with something that's gonna sound backwards at first. One of the biggest things keeping people from hitting $100,000 faster is this idea of the responsible purchase. And I know that sounds insane because we're conditioned to think that being responsible with money is, the whole point, but hear me out on this. There's this spending pattern I see constantly where people justify purchases by framing them as responsible, practical, or necessary. Like they need a car, right? So instead of buying some old beater for $3,000 that'll get them from point A to point B, they finance a $28,000 sedan because it's reliable and they need something that won't break down and it's got good safety ratings. And look, I'm not saying drive a death trap. But here's what happens. They're now paying $450 a month plus insurance that's way higher because it's a newer car, plus higher registration fees. That's probably $600-$700 a month in total car costs. And in their mind, this is being responsible. They're not buying a luxury car. They're not being frivolous. They're making a sensible choice. But here's the math that nobody wants to look at. That extra $400 or $500 a month that's going to car payments instead of into savings, over 5 years, that's $30,000. $30,000 that could have been sitting in an index fund, growing, compounding, setting you up. Instead, it's gone into an asset that's depreciating the second you drive it off the lot. And it's not just cars. It's the good apartment in the nice neighborhood because you deserve to live somewhere decent. It's the organic groceries because you're investing in your health. It's the gym membership at the nice place because the cheap gym is depressing and you won't actually go. Every single one of these decisions is wrapped in this language of responsibility and self-care and making smart choices. But what's actually happening is you're spending away your margin. You're spending away the space between your income and expenses where wealth gets built. And the insidious part is that it feels good. It feels like you're being an adult, making mature decisions, not depriving yourself. I had this moment maybe 3 years ago where I was talking to my friend Lewis, and he was telling me about how he just signed the lease on a new apartment. Beautiful place, great location, and he was so proud of himself because he negotiated the rent down by $50 a month. $50! And he's telling me this like it's this huge win. But then in the same conversation, he mentioned he'd also just upgraded his phone plan because he needed more data, and that was an extra $30 a month. And he'd switched to this meal delivery service because he was tired of grocery shopping, and that was like $400 a month. And I didn't say anything because, it wasn't the moment. But I remember thinking, he's so focused on optimizing this one expense that he's completely blind to the fact that he's hemorrhaging money in 3 other directions, and he's justifying all of it as being responsible or necessary or just making his life easier. The path to $100,000 isn't about making 100 perfect decisions. It's about making 1 or 2 massive decisions that actually move the needle. It's about looking at your 3 or 4 biggest expenses and asking yourself, is this actually necessary, or have I just convinced myself it is because I want it and I found a way to make it sound reasonable? The trap of just a little bit. Here's another thing, and this one's subtle, but it's probably responsible for more financial stagnation than almost anything else. The incremental lifestyle inflation that happens so slowly you don't even notice it. You get a raise. Let's say you are making $55,000 and now you're making $62,000. That's $7,000 more a year, which is like what? Almost $600 a month after taxes? That should be going straight into your savings, right? That should be the thing that accelerates your timeline to $100,000. But what actually happens is this. You're making more money, so you feel like you can afford to loosen up a little bit. Maybe you start ordering delivery more often instead of cooking. Maybe you upgrade from the basic streaming services to the premium ones. Maybe you start buying the nicer coffee, or you get a car wash membership, or you start throwing in a few more impulse purchases when you're shopping because, hey, you can afford it now. And none of these things individually are a big deal. We're talking about $5 here, $15 there, maybe an extra $100 a month total. But that's the whole point. It doesn't feel like anything. It feels like you're just enjoying the fruits of your labor a little bit. You worked hard for that raise. Why shouldn't you live slightly better? But here's what's actually happening. You've taken that entire raise and diffused it across a dozen tiny lifestyle upgrades that don't actually improve your life in any meaningful way, and now your savings rate hasn't changed at all. You're making more money, but you're not building wealth any faster. You're just living slightly more comfortably in the same financial position you were in before. And the thing is, I get it. I really do. Because there's this psychological thing where making more money makes you feel like you should be living better. There's this sense of, I've arrived at a new level, and you want your life to reflect that. It's almost like you feel embarrassed or like you're doing something wrong if you're making $62,000 but still living like you make $55,000. But the people who build wealth quickly, the ones who hit $100,000 in their savings account way sooner than their peers, they're the ones who break that connection. They're the ones who get the raise and they don't touch their lifestyle. They just pretend the raise didn't happen and they route that entire amount straight into their savings or investments. And I know that sounds joyless. I know it sounds like, what's the point of making more money if you're not going to enjoy it? But here's the thing. You are enjoying it. You're enjoying it in the form of options. You're enjoying it in the form of security. You're enjoying it in the form of watching that savings account number climb and knowing that you're building something real. Because the truth is, that extra $150 a month spread across a dozen tiny upgrades isn't actually making you happier. You're not waking up in the morning thinking, thank God I have the premium streaming service. But you know what does make you happier? Looking at your net worth and seeing it grow, knowing that you're 6 months ahead of schedule, knowing that you have options. There's this zone that a lot of people get stuck in, and I think it's one of the most dangerous places you can be financially. It's the zone of almost enough. You're not broke, you can pay your bills, you've got a little bit in savings, maybe a few $1,000s. You're not stressed about money on a day-to-day basis. Life is fine. And that fine is the trap. Because when things are fine, there's no urgency. There's no reason to make the hard changes or the uncomfortable sacrifices. Because you're not in crisis mode. You're comfortable enough that you don't feel poor, but you're not building wealth fast enough to feel rich. You're just there, in the middle, treading water. And the years go by like that. 5 years, 10 years, and you're basically in the same place financially. Maybe your salary went up. Maybe you've got a little more in your 401k. But in terms of actual liquid wealth, actual money that you control and can deploy, you're not that much further ahead than you were when you started. I see this all the time with people in their 30s and 40s who have good jobs, who are smart and hardworking, but they've been living in this comfort zone for so long that they've lost the ability to see how much they're actually capable of. They've settled into this lifestyle that matches their income almost perfectly, and they've convinced themselves that this is just how it is, that building serious wealth is for other people, people who make more money, or who got lucky, or who are willing to live like monks. But the reality is, most people could cut their expenses by 20 or 30% without their quality of life actually changing in any meaningful way. I'm not talking about eating ramen and living in a basement. I'm talking about the stuff that you're barely conscious of. The subscriptions you don't use, the convenience purchases that you make out of habit, the marginally nicer versions of things that you buy because you can technically afford them. If you're making $70,000 a year and spending 65, you're saving 5 grand a year. At that rate, it takes you 20 years to save 100,000, not even accounting for inflation or unexpected expenses. But if you cut your spending to 55,000, which is very, very doable if you're honest with yourself about what you actually need versus what you've just gotten used to, you're now saving 15 grand a year. That's 100,000 in less than 7 years. And that's without any raises, without any side income, without any investment returns. Just the raw math of spending less than you make by a meaningful margin. The people who hit 100,000 fast are the ones who break out of that comfort zone. They're the ones who look at their lifestyle and say, yeah, this is fine, but fine isn't going to get me where I want to be. And they make the decision to be temporarily uncomfortable, to live a little below their means, to say no to things that other people at their income level are saying yes to, because they're optimizing for a different goal. The seduction of complexity. Here's something I've noticed that I think is really worth talking about. People overcomplicate building wealth because simple feels too easy. And if it feels too easy, it doesn't feel like it's working. There's this weird psychological thing where we think that if the solution isn't complex or sophisticated or innovative, then it can't possibly be effective. So people spend all this time researching the perfect investment strategy or trying to time the market or looking for some arbitrage opportunity or getting into real estate or crypto or whatever the hot thing is at the moment. And I'm not saying those things can't work. Some of them absolutely can. But here's what I've seen happen over and over again. People get so caught up in finding the optimal strategy that they never actually execute on the simple, boring thing that would have gotten them to 100,000 way faster. The simple, boring thing is this: spend significantly less than you make and put the difference into a boring index fund, and don't touch it. That's it. That's the whole thing. But nobody wants to hear that because it's not sexy. It's not a hack. It's not innovative. It doesn't make you feel smart. And so people reject it in favor of something more complex, and the complexity becomes an excuse for inaction. I've seen people spend 6 months researching real estate investment strategies, reading books, listening to podcasts, joining forums, and in that 6 months, they've saved nothing because they're waiting to have enough for a down payment on a rental property. Meanwhile, if they'd just been throwing $1,000 a month into an index fund that whole time, they'd have 6 grand in the market, working for them, compounding. The other thing complexity does is it gives you an out when things don't work. If your strategy is complicated and you're not seeing results, you can always tell yourself, well, I must be doing it wrong, or I need to learn more, or I need to adjust my approach. It becomes this endless optimization project where you never have to face the simple truth that maybe you're just not saving enough money. But if your strategy is simple, spend less, save more, invest in index funds, there's nowhere to hide. Either you're doing it or you're not. And if you're not seeing results, it's because you're not executing, not because your strategy is flawed. And look, I get it. Simple is boring. Simple doesn't feel like you're playing the game at a high level. But you know what's not boring? Having $100,000. That part's actually pretty exciting. The identity problem. This one's deeper and it's uncomfortable, but I think it's maybe the most important thing I'm going to say. A lot of people don't hit 100,000 faster because deep down, they don't see themselves as the kind of person who has $100,000. There's this identity thing that happens where you internalize a certain narrative about who you are and what you're capable of financially. Maybe you grew up without much money and somewhere along the way you absorbed this idea that you're not a money person. Or maybe you're in a friend group or a family where nobody has significant savings. And so the idea of being the person who does feels like a betrayal or feels like you're putting on airs. And this identity shapes your behavior in ways that are almost invisible. It's not that you're actively sabotaging yourself, it's more like you're unconsciously making decisions that keep you aligned with your identity. So if you see yourself as someone who's bad with money, you're gonna make bad with money decisions because that's who you are. If you see yourself as someone who's generous and spontaneous, you're gonna spend money generously and spontaneously because that's your identity. The problem is that your identity is mostly just a story you've been telling yourself for a long time, and stories can change. But changing them requires you to first recognize that they're just stories, not fundamental truths about who you are. I had to go through this myself. I had this whole identity wrapped up in being creative and spontaneous and not being tied down by money or material stuff. And that sounds very enlightened and free-spirited, but what it actually meant in practice was that I was constantly broke, and I justified it by telling myself I was above caring about money. I was the artsy friend who was always borrowing 20s and paying people back eventually. And that was my identity. And at some point, I had to look at that and realize, okay, this identity is costing me my future. This identity is keeping me from having options. And I had to make a decision to change the story, not by becoming some different person, but by expanding my sense of who I was to include someone who also built wealth. And it sounds simple when I say it like that, but it's actually really hard because it requires you to step outside of the narrative you've been living in and see it from the outside. It requires you to question the story you tell about yourself when you spend money, or when you don't save money, or when you make financial decisions that you know aren't great, but you do them anyway because that's just how you are. The people who build wealth quickly are usually people who've done this identity work, even if they don't call it that. They've decided that they're the kind of person who builds wealth, and they've aligned their behavior with that identity, and everything flows from that. The comparison trap. Here's something that's become way worse in the age of social media: the comparison trap. And I don't even mean comparing yourself to people who are wildly rich. I mean comparing yourself to people who are in your approximate income bracket, but who seem to be living way better than you. Your coworker who's always taking trips, your friend from college who just bought a house, your cousin who seems to have endless disposable income for hobbies and going out in nice clothes. And you're sitting there thinking, how are they affording this? We make basically the same amount of money. What am I doing wrong? And here's the thing. You're probably not doing anything wrong. There's a very good chance they're either in debt, or they're not saving anything, or they have help that they're not advertising. But because you're only seeing the surface, the vacations, the purchases, the lifestyle, you feel like you're falling behind. And that feeling makes you want to spend more to keep up, to maintain the appearance of being at the same level. This is one of the most wealth-destroying forces out there, and it's almost entirely psychological. Because rationally, you know that building wealth requires saving money. You know that if your friend is spending everything they make, they're probably not building wealth. But emotionally, it doesn't feel that way. Emotionally, it feels like they're winning and you're losing. And so you spend money you shouldn't spend, or you don't save as much as you could because you're trying to maintain parity with people who are probably not in as good a financial position as they appear to be. The people who hit 100,000 fast are the ones who've completely opted out of this comparison game. They've made peace with the fact that they might look like they're living below their means, because they are. They've made peace with the fact that they're not always going to be able to do the things their friends are doing or buy the things their peers are buying. And they're okay with that because they know what they're building. It's like there's this decision point where you have to choose between looking wealthy and being wealthy. And most people choose looking wealthy without even realizing that's the choice they're making. The emergency fund paralysis. This one's counterintuitive, but I think it's worth talking about. There's this advice that gets thrown around constantly in personal finance circles about how you need to have 3 to 6 months of expenses saved up in an emergency fund before you do anything else. And on the surface, that makes sense. You want a cushion. You want to be prepared for emergencies. But here's what I've seen happen. People get so fixated on building this perfect emergency fund that they never actually start investing. They've got $8,000 sitting in a savings account earning basically nothing, and they're still adding to it because they're trying to get to 12,000 or 15,000 or whatever number they've decided is the right amount. And meanwhile, they're not putting anything in the market. They're not building real wealth. They're just accumulating cash that's losing value to inflation while they wait to feel safe enough to start investing. And I'm not saying don't have an emergency fund. I'm saying that the emergency fund can become this excuse for not taking the next step. It becomes this perpetual state of, I'm not quite ready yet, that stretches on for years. The truth is, a smaller emergency fund is probably fine, especially if you've got decent job security and a credit card you could use in a real emergency. Like $3,000 is probably enough for most people. Beyond that, you're better off getting your money into the market where it can actually grow. But people get paralyzed by this idea that they need to have everything perfectly set up before they start building wealth. And that perfectionism, that need to have all your ducks in a row before you take action, it costs you years. Because the market doesn't care if your emergency fund is optimal. The market's going to keep doing its thing, and every month that you're not invested is a month of potential growth that you're missing out on. The people who hit 100,000 fast are the ones who have good enough systems, not perfect systems. They're the ones who say, okay, I've got a few grand set aside, that's probably fine. Now let me start actually building wealth. The income excuse. Last thing I want to talk about, and this one's tough because there's truth to it, but it also becomes an excuse that keeps people stuck. And that's the idea that you just don't make enough money to save. And look, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that saving is easy when you're making $35,000 a year in an expensive city. It's not. The math is harder, the margins are tighter. I'm not denying that reality. But here's what I've also seen. I've seen people making $40,000 find a way to save 5 or 6 grand a year. And I've seen people making $90,000 who save nothing. And the difference is almost never the income. It's the gap between the income and the lifestyle. If you're making $40,000 and spending $35,000, you're saving 5 grand a year. If you're making $90,000 and spending $88,000, you're saving 2 grand a year. The person making less than half is building wealth more than twice as fast. And so when people say, I just don't make enough to save, what they're usually actually saying is, given the lifestyle I've chosen, I don't have money left over. And that's a very different statement. Now, sometimes the lifestyle is truly non-negotiable. If you've got medical expenses or dependents, or you're living in a place where rent is genuinely unavoidable and expensive, that's real. But more often than I think people want to admit, the lifestyle is negotiable. It's just hard to negotiate it because it requires you to live differently than your peers, or differently than you think someone at your income level should live. But this is a thing. If you're waiting until you make more money to start saving, you're never going to start saving because every time your income goes up, your sense of what's normal and necessary goes up with it. The only way to break that cycle is to decouple your lifestyle from your income, which means making a decision about what you're willing to spend independent of what you could afford to spend. The people who hit 100,000 on modest incomes are the ones who figured this out. They figured out that it's not about making a lot of money, it's about creating a big gap between what you make and what you spend, and then sustaining that gap over time. Bringing it all together. So here's where we are. If you want to hit $100,000 faster, and I mean significantly faster, not like shaving a few months off, but potentially cutting years off the timeline, you have to stop doing these things. You have to stop justifying spending in the name of being responsible. You have to stop letting lifestyle inflation eat every raise you get. You have to stop being comfortable in the zone of almost enough. You have to stop overcomplicating the strategy and just execute on the simple, boring thing that works. You have to examine and potentially change the story you tell yourself about who you are with money. You have to stop comparing yourself to people whose financial reality you don't actually know. You have to stop letting the perfect emergency fund prevent you from investing. And you have to stop using income as an excuse. And I know that list sounds overwhelming. I know it sounds like a lot. But here's the thing. You don't have to fix all of these things at once. You just have to start. You just have to pick one of these behaviors and decide that you're going to do something different. Maybe it's the next time you're about to make a responsible purchase, you pause and ask yourself if you actually need it or if you've just found a way to justify it. Maybe it's the next time you get a raise, you set up an automatic transfer so that entire amount goes straight into savings before you even see it. Maybe it's just sitting down with your spending for the last 3 months and honestly looking at where the money's going and asking yourself if this is the life you want to be funding. Because here's what I've come to believe after thinking about this stuff for way too long. Building wealth isn't complicated, but it is hard. It's hard because it requires you to go against your instincts, against your social conditioning, against the stories you've been telling yourself about money and what you deserve and how life is supposed to work. But the reward for doing that hard thing is so much bigger than just having a number in your bank account. The reward is options. The reward is security. The reward is the ability to make decisions based on what you actually want instead of what you can afford. The reward is the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you're building something real. And $100,000 is not the end goal. It's not like you hit that number and suddenly your life is perfect and you never think about money again. But it's a milestone that changes things. It's proof that you can do this. It's momentum. It's the foundation for everything else you're going to build. So if you're ready to stop doing the things that are keeping you from getting there, if you're ready to make the uncomfortable changes that actually move the needle, then you're already ahead of most people. Because most people will watch this or read this or hear this, and they'll nod along and think, yeah, that makes sense. And then they'll go back to doing exactly what they were doing before. But not you. You're different. You're the person who actually changes. You're the person who hits 100,000 faster because you were willing to do what other people aren't willing to do. And that starts today. That starts right now. Not with some perfect plan or some optimal strategy, but just with one decision, one behavior that you're gonna stop, one habit that you're gonna change. So go do that, and then come back and do it again tomorrow, and the day after that. And before you know it, you're going to look up and realize you're way closer than you thought possible. That's how this works. That's how you get there faster.